All right, so I would say welcome everyone, and welcome Tanya Bolden from AIAG here for us presenting the topic of sustainability. And as in the events before, we will have the presentation from Tanya, and afterwards we will be available for questions, either through the chat, or you can we will unmute your microphones and you can ask the question if there are any directly. So again, thank you very much, Tanya, for joining us and providing us your perspective on the topic of sustainability. And I think I would just say I would hand it over to you. And we are very interested in what you have prepared for us. And I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will share my screen here.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I just want to thank Larissa, Andre, and the entire QM team. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this audience about sustainability. It's my understanding that this audience is a largely quality-focused audience, quality-focused subject matter experts, and I hope that through my presentation to you, I can show how sustainability and quality are closely related and even getting closer related based on various drivers that we think will benefit our companies, our organizations, as well as our industry for us to better understand and work more collaboratively together. So my name is Tanya Bolden. I am the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Supply Chain for AIAG. So today, I want to share with you a little bit about who AIAG is. I understand that many of you may have a working relationship with AIAG, but I want to give you a little more context around who we are, who we represent, how we work, how we engage, which will help you understand our perspective, our approach, and our benefit that we provide industry for doing so. I want to talk a little bit about sustainability drivers. I presume that a large number of the audience participants are from Europe, and you will be familiar with some of the points that I'm going to share with you. I'm going to talk to you about AIG's commitment to sustainability. I'm going to share some insight as to what we've done in terms of collaboration to address some of the issues that are confronting industry. Talk to you a little bit about the benefits, and then I look forward to hearing your questions in a Q&A session. So let's get started. Okay, and if at any time these slides are not legible, if I need to make them a little larger, please let me know. I know sometimes with Zoom or Teams, I may want it to go to one screen and it goes to a different one. So let's just feel free, raise your hand or put a note in chat if there's some change I need to make. But I think it's important for, as I mentioned, you all to understand who we are and what we do. On screen here, you see our team. We're not a huge team. AIG is a complete staff of about 51 individuals. And our vision is to be a catalyst, to drive change, and to work with industry to affect that change. AIG was started in 1982, so we have been in existence for over 40 years. And we were started by GM, Ford, and Chrysler because they realized that by asking the same information but in different ways, they were creating a burden on suppliers. And they wanted to work collaboratively to address that. And I will tell you today that in the course of the 40 years, we continue to work on those types of problems. I think we all know that there is a lot of burden and redundancy in the supply chain. So our role is to identify those issues, work with industry collaboratively to try to mitigate that risk. So we bring together the brightest minds. So AIAG consists of, again, we're an industry association. So we have members representing OEMs and suppliers, professional firms such as audit firms, law firms, and also other stakeholders. Our goal is to bring all of these bright minds together to identify the problems, but more importantly, brainstorm and identify solutions to those problems. And we need all the stakeholders at the table to handle that. And that is largely what we do. Now, the products, the solutions that we identify are usually in the form of training, publication, or events. Okay, that's how we disseminate the information that we've worked together on. We provide knowledge, training, again, to make sure that we're level setting the industry and helping suppliers mature where they are. Okay? Now, our expertise areas are quality. ISO, we work with IATF 16949 and all of those standards, but we also have the two areas that I lead, corporate responsibility and supply chain. Those are our three long-standing expertise areas, but we will be moving into a fourth, and that's looking at data through tools such as Katina X, which I imagine some of you may be familiar with. But if not, feel free to ask me a question about that. So let's talk about the numbers. AIG is the largest global automotive association. We have 30 plus OEMs, 4,000 plus suppliers, and 400 plus expert partners that we work with. Just to give you, excuse me, just to quantify us for that. Now, quickly here, I'm going to share with you who are some of the brands that we work with. Hopefully, you'll recognize some, if not all of them, and some of them may be your own company. So you'll see our board of directors is represented by both OEMs and suppliers. We have a diverse group. They're not just automotive. You'll see heavy equipment on here. You'll see logistics. You'll also see in a next slide, I'll show you how global we are in our reach. Now, here are our global OEM members. You'll see on the left side of this screen, those are our board member companies. But on the right side, you will see all the other companies that, again, show the diversification of who we as an industry represent and who we engage. And as I mentioned, we also have suppliers that are a part of our organization as well as our board. The board companies on the left, and here's just a sampling of the suppliers that we represent. Okay. So how do we work? How do we take all of these companies and all of these issues, and how do we manage that? So AIG is a member-based organization. As I mentioned, we have over 4,000 members. But more importantly, every employee at our member companies can engage with us at AIAG. It is through that subject matter expertise that we're able to convene and bring the right and most knowledgeable people to the table to address the issues. So you see here on the diagram, we identify the issues. We work collaboratively with industry experts to better define the issues, to identify what are the potential solutions. Then we work collaboratively to develop those, which gives us the ability to create industry best practices and standards. We provide insight and awareness because some of our groups, they're advisory groups. They work with us and partner with us in interacting with other organizations. As I mentioned, AIG is not strictly automotive. It's a broad cross-section because we need to make sure we're representing the various stakeholders that are within our complex supply chain. And that requires AIG to work with various organizations, governmental agencies as well. We do not do advocacy, but we do what we call technical advocacy. And what that is we will work with governmental organizations to make sure that we fully understand the letter and the spirit of legislation and regulations, such that collaboratively we can work with industry to make sure that our industry partners are meeting the spirit of the law or the regulation. Okay, so that's how we work. It's very collaborative. We work with advisory, we form advisory groups. We have steering committees that help provide input and insight into the work that AIAG is doing, such that we are aligning to the North Star or the KPIs for not only AIAG, but for our board of directors and what they have called us to do. And we want to make sure that we are leveraging and utilizing our volunteers in the most efficient and most effective way. Okay. So moving on. So what are some of the achievements that we've done? And I won't read the slide here, but as I mentioned, we provide deliverables, or we disseminate our deliverables in the form of training. So you'll see an education stat there. The events, you'll see how we convene individuals. And more AIAG is not only doing in-person events, but we're doing virtual events, such that we can reach audiences that are not able to, either just for logistics or for cost reasons, that aren't able to travel to our events. And we're finding a great deal of success in that. One area in which we are making a concerted effort to work closely with is here in North America. We're doing a lot of interactions and activities in Mexico, because we know that there's a great deal of interest in Mexico. We work collaboratively with organizations throughout Europe and Canada as well. Now, I also mentioned another form of which we provide or disseminate the information that we work to develop is through publications. And you'll see some of the numbers there of our electronic publications, as well as hard copy publications, and the fact that we do translations in various languages. We have self-assessments, we do certifications, and we have a great deal of volunteers. That's where we derive a great deal of our subject matter expertise. Okay, so now that I've shared a little bit more about AIAG, hopefully giving you a little bit more in terms of the context of who we are, how we do what we do, and the perspective that we hold, let's talk about some of the drivers. Now, there are, in my research, I just wanted to bring forward 5 key pieces of legislation that are really affecting how we are trying to organize and manage in the space of sustainability. I hope you do recognize some of these. So there is a great deal of information here, and I'm not going to take the next 4 hours to take you through all of that. I just have a highlight on each one of these to show or to bring forward how they impact sustainability, but more importantly, what the expectation or the risk is to our supply chain based on these pieces of legislation. So let's take a look at the first one here, and we simply call it CS-DDD, but you'll see that this has a human rights impact, an environmental impact, as well as a corporate accountability impact. And I often get the question, which of these is greater? And I think it's important for suppliers to understand where they have risks. Every supplier is different from one another. Where they source goods are different. Where they do business is different than the others. Where they're headquartered, where they have operations. Companies have to understand their degree of exposure to then be able to ascertain if or how pieces of legislation I'm going to discuss with you today impact them. And as I mentioned, I just picked 5, but there are a plethora of pieces of legislation and regulations that are out there coming from various countries. So again, this is CSR Triple D. I'm not in the habit of reading slides, so I'll just point out some highlights. These slides will be available to you all, so please feel free to consume them and reference them as you see fit. So that's CSR Triple D. Now, there is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, as we call it here in the US. This, like many other pieces of legislation from Germany, Canada, Mexico, Europe, all are intended to eradicate forced labor from the supply chain. There's legislation that's on the books and has been for a few years. There's the EU Modern Slavery Act, which is another piece of legislation that is out there. But why I identify UFLPA is the fact that it is different in how it is trying to drive compliance. With legislation such as the German due diligence legislation, companies have to prove to the US government that forced labor was not used in the manufacture or production of their goods. And if they cannot satisfactorily prove that to Germany, then they are subject to monetary fines or excluded from bid lists. That is typically the way that countries or legislative bodies are leveling penalties to drive action. UFLPA is different, though. This is one piece of legislation that we have seen in the US that is different than our entire jurisprudence system. UFLPA presumes a company is guilty, and it's upon the company to prove that they have not used forced labor in their goods. This legislation differs from other countries in that it has given the rights to the US Customs and Border Protection to enforce this. So what that means is a shipment can approach the border, whichever border, covers all of our borders, regardless of the mode of transportation. Goods reach the border, and if the US government has reason to believe or suspect that either because of the commodity within the goods being imported or where they're likely coming from, CBP, again, US Customs and Border Protection, can prevent those goods from coming in the country. They would issue a notice of detention. Again, the presumption is the importer is guilty. And the importer must then prove their innocence to allow the goods in the country. They have 30 days, 30 days, in order to provide that. Okay? So at that point in time, they must demonstrate their due diligence in what they're doing to prove that they have visibility down to the reasonable country of origin or raw material. Now, there's a number of documents that can be provided, but ultimately CBP wants to know that companies are not just bringing goods to the border, not understanding their supply chain. Should they not prove that the goods were made without forced labor, those goods are prohibited from coming into the country. Therefore, those goods would then be, well, just the mere fact of them being detained has a negative impact on scheduling and meeting your customer requirements. But additionally, there's costs that are levied from that delay. There's costs that are either levied from returning the goods from which they came or destroying the goods. So that's where industry really has turned its attention in looking at compliance with UFLPA because of the different approach that the U.S. government has taken. And what we do know from past pieces of legislation, governments can change their approach to the legislation. They can change the focused region. For UFLPA, it's focused on the Xinjiang region in China, as are most pieces of legislation. But they're also looking to other countries where they know labor is being relocated, such as Thailand and Malaysia. Those are also countries that are red flagged for CBP. Other countries, Canada, Mexico, again, Germany, are all monitoring and evaluating the progress of this because they can, at any point in time, make a change to make their legislation more restrictive. Okay. So, Andrea, I'm seeing some questions come in. Would you like to hold the questions to the end, or?
I mean, it's up to you if we can let them ask right away, so we're not advanced in the topic. I think it's up to you, Tanya, whatever you prefer.
Okay, not a problem. I've seen a couple come in. So if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free.
So there was a question asking what stands behind the rigorous auditing to identify and mitigate risks of forced labor in the supply chain. Is that required to be an on-site audit?
Well, audits, really when we talk about social audits, that is not something that is universally done within many of the companies. I can tell you we are talking about moving in that direction. The companies that are doing social audits, they are either doing the audits themselves, auditing their suppliers, or they are working with a third-party auditor to take a look at those. There's an organization that some of you may be familiar with, and it's RBA, but it's Responsible Business Alliance, and they are doing social audits. So that is where you have a third-party audit. I cannot speak to the degree of rigor that is in there, but I do know it is not done across the board for all companies, such as you see within quality, where there being an industry quality standard. The RBA social audits are done by automotive companies, electronic companies. It varies.
Is there anything you could maybe say about like a red flag or countries with red flags at the moment on this topic?
On the topic of forced labor? Yes, I would say that the topic of red flags is really gotten into the standpoint of knowledge and data, and it gets to AI. What U.S. Customs and Border Protection is doing to enable them to have insight into the supply chain is they are using companies right now that are using AI tools and publicly screening tools that give them the indicators or the red flags that you mentioned. Okay. They're checking publicly available records, and when I say they, I mean the service providers who are using a lot of these big data tools. They are looking to identify publicly available information, announcements of where a company may acquire new business, or oftentimes in certain countries where a company gets a government contract, they make that publicly known. They're proud of that. They share that information. But that also gives an indication of the relationship they have to the government. It will also announce where they're doing operations and business. They're checking public records to see where a company who may have been found to be a bad actor may regroup, change the board of directors, change the name of the CEO. It's through the scraping of public data such as that, in addition to understanding the logistics routes of goods to know where they're coming from, where they're coming to, what's being migrated. It's gathering all of this data that is helping to give CBP a red flag as to why they may suspect and issue a notice of detention. And I surmise that there are other countries that are doing similar information to get a handle. It's, I think within the automotive industry, we've mentioned for many, many years how complex we are, how diversified we are with the contractual relationships that we have. A company right now today may not know who their tier 4, 5 supplier is, but the expectation is that they find a way to be able to do that. Okay. Is there another question or?
I was just looking at the question. Yes, so there's some questions coming up around the actually naming, or is there any kind of public or from RBA available or from AIG available list of kind of indicating what countries are in which risk category or red flag countries? Or is there any information that people can go to see which countries are considered as red flag countries, for example?
Yes, actually, the U.S. government on their website, and you could go to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they have a web page that talks about UFLPA. I would say they go a step further than the question that's being asked. We do know that there are certain countries that the China government is alleged to be relocating some of the Uyghur populations to work. That information is available on the website. But there's also a document called the Entity List. It's the US Entity List. And what it is a list of companies, their names are listed on there, of companies whose goods are prohibited from coming into the US. Okay. Right now, today, there are 140 companies that are on that entity list. Their goods are prohibited. So if any of those companies are in the supply chain, again, through AI data and public scraping, we can get a good indication as to that. Those goods are prohibited. The US government, as I understand, we last received an update to that entity list in August. I have received intel that they are going to be updating that list on a quarterly basis going forward. So therefore, this list will grow, and the government is being very active in how they identify this. It's freely available, so everyone on this call would be able to go and see those companies. And that is one thing that AIG and the OEMs are encouraging companies to do. Be familiar with that list. Make sure that those companies are not in your supply chain such that you don't receive a surprise at the border because CBP has reason to suspect that that may be a company in your supply chain. Yes, it's the UFLPA entity list.
I've just shared the link. So if anybody wants to go in the chat, there's a link to this specific entity list with companies listed.
Yes.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you. All righty, so let's keep going. And Andre, just let me know if you want me to pause and ask some questions. I know sometimes the timing is better to answer the question right then.
Yeah, sure. And there was one more question regarding European OEMs. I'm not sure if you can talk to if there's something like a red flag list from European OEMs. Do you know anything about that, how they define it? I mean, you're talking from the US perspective.
Yes, that is because it's a US, UFLPA is US legislation. I am not aware of a entity list or something comparable, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is. If not an existing document, but they're working towards something of that nature. Okay. But again, for German legislation, Canadian legislation, Mexico legislation. At present, each one is focused on eradicating forced labor in the supply chain as a whole, but often we know that the Xinjiang region is the one that is primarily focused on.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, and other the usual, I mean, we have the sanction list, the EU sanction list for sanctioned, yeah, for sanctioned companies. I think other than that, I am not aware of any specific to forced labor as well.
Yeah, I mean, and then there are OFAC lists. You know, there are certain countries that I know the U.S. places on a list that we will not do business with. That may, given a lot of geopolitical issues that are going on right now, there may be something similar that exists in various countries based on who they identify their trading partners as, their trading partners. Okay. Alrighty, so if there are no other questions on UFLPA, we can keep going. And as people think of them, we can discuss at the end. I think we have time to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk about the EU battery regulation. Now, again, we're seeing a trend coming with European legislation, whereas before you had legislation that was focused on a specific issue. Personally, I'm seeing the European legislation is bringing in various factors. So we just talked about that with CSR Triple D and the fact that it had a social component and environmental component. When we look at the EU battery regulation, there's sustainability requirements, there are environmental requirements, there's circular economy. And these issues are getting so complex, it's hard to decouple some of these issues. So I understand why we're seeing the legislation come out touching those various points. But what that does is it builds in the complexity that makes it even more challenging for companies to be able to comply. And again, I want to restate that I think one of the first and early steps that a company should take is to identify where your operations are located and what risks you have exposure to. Then, by delving deeper into the requirements that affect that geographic location or that product or that sector of the industry, it can help you understand and prioritize what you must comply with and how you must meet those compliance elements. Okay, so again, EU battery regulation. As the industry grows to be more innovative and moving to adopt EV batteries, and let me just say that I know that there has been a softening of EV battery projections, or EV vehicle projections, I should say. But what I have heard in many meetings with the OEMs, EV vehicles are not going away. There's a lot of competition on EV vehicles. So the rate and the pace of what we may have initially thought a few years ago has changed, but EV vehicles are here to stay. But that also brings about an issue on the availability of the materials, how to obtain them, and the means in which they are obtained, meaning is forced labor or child labor being utilized in the extraction methods? Are we looking at materials such as natural rubber and how we're acquiring that, and what we are in effect doing to deteriorate the land? All of these issues come into play when we look at how we produce our products. Is there a more sustainable way for us to produce our products? Is there a different material or commodity that we can use? All of those conversations are being looked at. And in part, that's what this legislation or these types of legislation, that's a byproduct of that. They want to make sure, they being the legislative or regulatory bodies, want to make sure that companies have the visibility in their supply chain, understand the impact that they have, and find ways to mitigate them. Okay, so this is another big piece of legislation that is driving what we do in sustainability. Okay. So next, let's talk about the digital product passport. Now, this takes sustainability reporting and understanding to yet a different level. So it's not only the physical part in which this piece of legislation wants a company to have an understanding of, but they also want them to have a digital product. So you will have a physical product, and then you will, in essence, have a digital product that you would want to understand, be able to manage that, and be able to report on that. So ultimately, this is driving product transparency, consumer awareness, so our consumers fully understand the impact that our products have on their communities or themselves, themselves, I should say, their health. And then there's the regulatory compliance piece of that. Now, one thing that I'll speak about briefly is the chemical aspect of it. So in short, companies are being asked to have not only the visibility and understanding of the people who manufacture their products, the chemical composition of that, and the material composition of that. So it's a tall order. There's a lot that companies must understand in terms of having the visibility into their supply chain and, more importantly, their products. So the EU Green Deal is the fifth piece of legislation I wanted to highlight for you that deals with climate neutrality. There's the legislative reform aspect of that, and then there's emission reduction, because carbon is yet another factor in which companies have to understand from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 factor. So what emissions are your facilities emitting? What emissions are being emitted in the manufacture of your products? And 2, what emissions are being emitted from the transportation of your products? And that is on my part an oversimplification, but just for the sake of conversation, just to let you know how broad carbon emissions reporting covers. And then lastly, just some conclusion here on the legislative piece of it. The importance of compliance is key. Governments, regulators are getting far more stringent with the license to operate, if you will. For companies that are not compliant, they're either punitive damages, they could run the risk of not having the license to operate in a particular country, or definitely it's the interruption of the flow of goods, which is another risk that comes from that. Overall, we're trying to drive sustainable innovation and understanding, but contributing to the global goals. I think we're all familiar with the Paris Accord, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, really trying to drive global progress in meeting those various goals. So I'll pause here if there are any questions we can address, Andre.
Yeah, maybe one that came me to mind is the question of, we've talked about those, let's say the due diligence on certain regulations and on legislation. Is there any guidance what you would suggest as like what companies could do in terms of making sure or to enhance the compliance and have a certain improvement of the transparency? So kind of what would you recommend as practical steps that companies could undertake to ensure the compliance in the supply chain?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that, because I think this is the right audience to have the discussion. These issues that we're talking about in compliance in these various areas cannot be the responsibility of one individual or one staff in an organization. I think automotive has done an excellent job of building and strengthening our quality audit and process muscle, if you will. We have great audit and quality standards and processes in place. And oftentimes, when I speak with sustainability professionals, they look to the rigor and the development that's been done in quality. So we have to look at how we can take some of those learnings that have developed over the past 30, 40 years in quality and apply those to other areas. I think a company, to understand and address some of these factors, they have to have, one, participation and support at the highest levels in their company. They have to have integrated groups that are looking across the business, regionally and globally, to again identify what those risks are, determine and have that visibility into your supply chain so that there are no surprises. But also, you have to look at your internal operations and your processes to see how you can take a, FMEA. That's a process that's widely used in the quality audience. How can we take the acumen of that and apply that in other areas of the business to build those processes such that they become operational? And there are various stakeholders that need to be at that internal table. Again, you need to have CEO support. You've got to have purchasing involved. You've got to have your quality management people there. You've got to have your supplier management individuals there, your logistics individuals, your customs and trade individuals there. So I think the companies that do the best bring all of those functions together and have those conversations, but understand that these issues aren't going away. They're not one and done. They're all going to grow in importance and complexity. So how can companies start simply and small and build their operations? But the next step from there is to also be helping to develop your suppliers, getting them to understand that their role is just as important, and helping them to mature in their progress and communicating the expectation that these types of processes and procedures should be cascaded throughout the supply chain. Because remember, legislators and government have the expectations that companies have visibility to the reasonable country of origin of the raw material. That makes every business partner you have important to the process. So we've got to help develop them, provide processes and directions, but most importantly, the expectations that these types of procedures need to be rolled down. Okay.
Thank you on that. And I mean that answer actually leads to the question from your perspective. What do you think, in your opinion, at the moment could be the greatest challenge, or which of those regulations you think could be the greatest challenge at the moment for automotive supplier area?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that's the answer to that is not one size fits all, because as I mentioned, each company is structured differently, where they're headquartered, where they have operations, the commodities that they produce, where they obtain their materials. One company could have a very short supply chain, maybe 3 suppliers in their supply chain. Another could have 30. More importantly, others may not know how many suppliers they have in their supply chain because of that complexity. So I think the greatest risk that companies are looking to manage is that visibility into the supply chain. They have to understand who's in their supply chain, where they're located, and what the risk is. So to me, I think that's, if there's no other message or point I can deliver today, that is the importance of the visibility into the supply chain, understanding your exposure.
Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah, and I think that's a common theme that, well, that one point is one that addresses the various pieces of legislation. That is the expectation of governments, that companies understand their supply chain.
Thank you, Tanya.
All righty. So now let's talk a little bit more about what AIG is doing in light of all of these issues and what we're doing to work with our companies. Now, again, corporate responsibility, one of the expertise areas that we have. I want to talk to you a little bit about AIG's commitment to sustainability. And the first and most important piece I want to share with you is the Automotive Global Guiding Principles. And I do hope that you all are familiar with this document here. I want to give you just a little bit of background on this. And actually, in the interest of time, I probably will not go to the website, but here you will find on this slide a link to AIAG's website. So, and it'll give you the history of these documents, which I will just share here briefly. Now, prior to coming to AIAG, I've been with AIAG for 15 years. And prior to coming to AIAG, I was with General Motors, and I was the corporate responsibility manager there. And I worked on a corporate staff in my work. And I actually was one of those AIAG volunteers that I told you about. I would come to AIAG and I would work with the other OEMs on this project. This project actually started in 2006 is when I came to my first meeting at AIAG. And we were working with Ford and Chrysler at the time to reach alignment on what we call the working conditions principles, focused on making sure that we were respecting the communities in which we were operating, focused on social issues. We didn't even call it human rights then, it was working conditions. Well, that one-page document has grown and it evolved over the years. And every 2 to 3 years, we did an update to it. You'll see I mentioned that it was GM, Ford, and Chrysler that were working on it, but you'll see now, based on the brands you see reflected here, that the initiative grew. AIG began working with Drive Sustainability, which some of you may be familiar with. It is the European OEM work group that is focused on sustainability. They also have Drive Plus, which is a supplier version, but AIG works on this document with Drive Sustainability. So over time, not only did this project grow to expand to 14 North American and European brands, it grew in scope and scale. This document not only covers social issues, or what we now refer to as human rights, but there's also environmental standards and business ethics. On or around 2014, the OEMs said we needed to come up with additional guidance to be far more clear in what we're communicating to our suppliers as our expectation. From that conversation, you'll see the green image there, the practical guidance document came into being. So what started in 2008, we launched the one-page working conditions document, has now grown to a 6-page guiding principles document and a 21-page practical guidance document. I will tell you that there is a plethora of information that's in there, going all the way to animal testing, deforestation, deregulation. These documents started off being aspirational. It's what the OEMs wanted their suppliers to be able to embrace and be able to adopt and comply with. Over time, not only has the document grown, and again, the number of participating OEMs, but the scope and scale, it is moving from language that references shoulds and shalls to musts. More and more, it's moving to requirements. Okay. The last update we did to this document was in 2022. Later next year, we will be looking at another update. The 2022 update did align with the German due diligence legislation. But of the 5 pieces of legislation that I mentioned to you a moment ago, we have not begun looking at those and incorporating those into this document. And I anticipate that is going to happen at the evaluation we do next year. Now, we're pleased to say that the global guiding principles are applicable with the global standards you'll see reflected on the left side of the screen. And to operationalize this, you will see, perhaps some of you are familiar with the supplier assessment. Actually, it's referred to as the SAQ. It's done by NQC, and it's called the SAQ 5.0. That supplier assessment questionnaire is based predominantly on the guiding principles. So you will see how, and years ago, we used to do trainings. I know Drive Sustainability is probably still doing some degree of education on this, but these 2 documents are the foundational documents for AIAG's corporate responsibility initiatives as well as Drive Sustainability. We operationalize it by the SAQ 5.0, in which I would say there are over 120,000 suppliers that are doing that supplier assessment questionnaire. So if your company is doing the supplier assessment questionnaire and you want to understand the methodology or the expectations of your customers, I would encourage you to visit AIG's website and you can download these documents. They're freely available. But this is one thing that we definitely want the industry to be aware of. This does represent AIG's commitment to sustainability in the supply chain.
And Tanya, if I may interrupt here I think we had 2 questions. One was a good question about talking the Rio Declaration and generally Paris Agreement. And I think, as the person who raised the question said, they have not been re-signed or signed again from the US for these declarations in terms of environmental protection or sustainability. Is that something that AIAG is considering, or is it that you still are kind of entailing or incorporating those requirements into your guidelines? Or how would that US perspective or the government's perspective would impact AIAG's way on here?
We have not changed the guiding principle since 2022. So in the next update that we do move forward, I anticipate that we will keep the environmental protections in this document. So both of these documents are around 3 core areas, again, human rights, environmental standards, and business ethics. I do not anticipate us making a change to withdraw any of the environmental references in here, because changes that may or may not come or stay within our current administration's adoption of these global standards. One thing we do have to realize is that AIAG, yes, is headquartered in the United States. However, our member companies, those 4,000 member companies, are headquartered around the globe. And even if a company is based in the United States, chances are they are doing operations in other countries where the laws, the requirements, the expectations are not necessarily changing. So although we are based here in the US, we must be very global in our approach and our outlook.
Thank you for highlighting that, Tanya. And one other question was, which countries are in the scope of sustainability risk, and who defines those? Or is there some classification or like a global ranking in terms of sustainability risk of countries?
No, there's not that we do at a collaborative level. So again, going back to what I was sharing on how we work collaboratively, how we do this document is we have I convene the volunteers that are the AIAG OEMs, which is most of them. And then we work collaboratively with Drive Sustainability that is representing the others. Okay. And it's through working with those companies, and those companies bring together not, insight as to where their operations have prioritized the countries that they need to focus on or the issues that they're trying to mitigate. So it is through working with the companies that the focus comes into being, or we may be looking to mitigate some problems that they may have experienced. So when we're talking about, let's say, deforestation, we're looking at the Brazilian rainforest. So what do we need to do to make sure that the suppliers in trying to get raw materials out of the rainforest are not degrading the environment there, the land there? So that's something that we will focus on, focused on the issue and where the country, where that issue is present in that particular country. There were issues about, cattle. Suppliers were, or the community was grazing cattle in the rainforest, and we were harvesting the leather for seats on cars. So looking at the supply chain and the sources of that. So it's not that AIG sits back with a list and say we're going to prioritize or focus on this country or this country. We follow the issues. And that's how we identify which countries are in scope, but it's more issue based or commodity based.
And when you say
Hopefully that answers.
the countries in scope, but there's not like something where people can refer to what AIG currently has a list on their countries based on those topics you mentioned. A list of these are currently the countries in scope from AIG in terms of sustainability risk or ranking.
No, we don't have a list such as that. Again, with having over 4,000 member companies in where they are around the globe. So another point that it may help address that, because we don't have a list, but I can tell you, and this slide does not reflect it, we translated these documents into 9 languages. So we have Spanish, we've got Hindi, we've got Turkish, we've got, and I'm not going to remember all 9 of them, but if that is some way to answer that question as to where we prioritize it, because we want to make sure that we're touching those languages. But Canada, we don't need to translate into Canada into French, although we that may be one of the languages. But no, we do not have an exact list of here are the countries that we prioritize. We try to make this document global. We try to make sure that it is in language to meet the needs of where the OEMs feel that we need to serve the suppliers within that population.
I think the topic of generally talking about I think the questions before around the regulations and some entities providing lists with listing specific companies or countries mostly comes from the fact that that maybe the approach from the suppliers is instead of evaluating their own supply chain and looking for potential risks on their suppliers, it's maybe sometimes easier to refer to a certain entity that provides a list that says these countries should be in your, so if you have those countries in your supply chain, we would recommend you to have a high risk with such and such countries. We have a medium risk at this and this countries, and we have a low risk on these and these countries. So companies could refer to some entity that provides them guidance of how they should look at the countries from their perspective.
So thank you for rephrasing the question. I understand where you're trying to obtain the data. There are organizations such as Transparency International that lists companies, countries, I should say, countries based on risk factors.
Mm.
But an individual must be cautious in doing that because we know that risks that we're talking about, and I'll just use forced labor as an example, that can transfer, that can change. And I'll give you another example. Conflict minerals. Back in 2010, when the legislation was proposed, but it was enacted in 2012, that companies were to publicly report if they were a publicly traded company in the US, if they had tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold in their product. Okay. And many of the resources that we look to, like I said, Transparency International was one, and we knew that the Democratic Republic of Congo was where that legislation was being focused. What we learned through working with organizations that had what we call boots on the ground, or people in the country, the bad actors were taking their practices and they could move it from mine to mine, or in some cases, we heard that they were moving to agricultural, and it was focused on bananas. So I say this to say, I wouldn't want a company to say, okay, this is where we're going to focus and only focus there, because there could be another surprise. The intel, the activities are so fluid and changing so often. Just be mindful of that. But right now, when we talk about bad actors, again, there's the OFAC list that we're looking at. If you're looking at carbon emissions, trying to see where the greatest carbon emissions are coming from, there's a plethora of information that's coming out from United Nations on where the highest number of carbon emissions are coming from. And that's evident by many of the countries that have declared when they're going to be carbon neutral or reach a carbon peak. You know, many countries and companies are saying that they're going to be carbon neutral or carbon free by 2030, 2035, whereas China is saying they're going to reach their carbon peak in 2030 with a reduction by 2060. So it's information such as that that's going to let you know where some of these companies stand. It depends on the question and what you're looking to solve as to what the answer could be. I'm sorry to be so vague with some of that, but there's just so many dependencies on some of the questions and the answers.
For sure, yeah. And I think there are certain, service providers where you can, you can Google service providers for ranking countries with certain risks. There are generally many service providers in providing if a company is looking for some form of external help for risk assessment on different companies, depending on their products. I think there are certain,
Yes.
services around that topic.
Correct. And there are also NGOs or non-governmental organizations that are monitoring a lot of this as well. So there's Human Rights Watch that will have information as it pertains to human rights abuses. As I mentioned, there's Transparency International that is looking at trade and corruption. There's the Sustainable Development UN websites that are talking broadly on many of these issues.
Right.
Okay. Again, as I mentioned, there's US that's talking about which countries we're focused on for forced labor that originates in China. Yeah, they're trade routes, they're logistics routes that identify other countries. Malaysia is a big one.
Mhm.
Okay. All righty. Let's see. So I'm going to skip this slide here. This is where I was going to go out and show you all the history that I gave you verbally, but feel free on your own to access this link here. It's live, and you can see the history in more detail as to how these guiding principles came into being.
I just got a comment that I provided the link for where you can register and download the principles.
Okay.
And it appeared to be that registration didn't work. So if somebody wants some more information, or if the download doesn't work or the registration doesn't work, I kindly ask to just write a short email to events@topqm.de. I put it in the chat, and we will take care of your problem. So we will try to help you get the document.
Yes, and just one comment on that. With AIG, those documents are available. You've got to go through our e-store, but as I mentioned, they're free. So you would download those and then you would be able to access them. Okay. And you would be able to access those in those 9 languages that I referenced.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Please feel free, download them, share them, cascade them broadly, because that does represent our commitment to sustainability in collaboration with the OEMs referenced. Okay. Now, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about chemical data. Now, for those on the call that are quality subject matter experts, I'm sure you're familiar with IMDS, or our International Material Data System. I think this is one of the best kept secrets within the automotive industry, because it's something that was developed 30 or so years ago to comply with ELV, end of life vehicle legislation. And this system that automotive has benefited not only for ELV compliance, but it's helped companies get partway through identifying conflict minerals, or 3TG, within their products. And we're looking to grow this. The IMDS steering committee, which is owned by OEMs, is expanding IMDS to become more sustainable, such that we will be able to report carbon at a part level, or product carbon footprint. AIG is deeply engaged in this, but we realize that for as much benefit and value that we derive from the IMDS system, there are some areas that need to be corrected. And we know that IMDS is part of, an IMDS submission is required for a PPAP approval. What we also know is that sometimes suppliers do not embrace the rigor that is required of the IMDS system. So they will simply put data in just to get the documentation they need to submit for part approval, which ultimately puts inaccurate or incomplete data into the system. And as we look to grow IMDS to be more sustainable, to report product carbon footprint, it's important that we go back and we focus on data quality. Helping individuals understand the importance of the data that needs to go into IMDS, the benefit, the access, and the value of the data that is within, and how companies can better leverage that. So that is why we are working on a data quality project. You'll see here, as I mentioned, there are various concerns that we're looking for IMDS to help companies address: conflict minerals, as I mentioned, critical minerals, when we talked about EV vehicles and understanding the composition of those materials, human slavery, BPR, and then recycle it. So this is one project in terms of sustainability, in terms of collaboration, that AIAG works with and is a part of a tripartite organization called Supplier Alliance, or SUAL is the acronym. AIG represents North America, CLEPA represents Europe, JAPIA represents Japan. This is the supplier voice into the IMDS Steering Committee OEMs. So this is an organized structure that we have. Again, it demonstrates global collaboration that AIG is a part of, suppliers as well as OEMs that are working together to address sustainability and bolster our systems that we use within automotive. Okay. Now, a second part to that is, again, the product carbon footprint, and some of the points that I've mentioned are referenced here. And how do we, at the same time, we're trying to improve the data, create greater awareness, because I will tell you that the IMDS folks who are looking, or materials managers, chemical managers, are very familiar with IMDS. Quality professionals are somewhat familiar with IMDS. Others in the companies do not have any knowledge of IMDS. What we've learned is that there's a great deal of data in here that, let's say, sustainability or the environmental audiences are not aware of, that they already have access to, and yet still they ask for surveys. Again, creating burden on the supply chain, asking for data that they likely already have access to. So the education piece of it is one very important component that AIG is working on. So we're looking to collaborate with industry on data quality, education, and awareness as we grow to be more sustainable. But then we're taking it to another level, and that is looking at Catena X. And if anyone is not familiar with Catena X, please, if you'll drop a question in the chat, we can make sure and answer that one, Andre. Otherwise, I will presume that we all have a working knowledge of it. But the IMDS Steering Committee, in their insight, has already worked with Catena X to develop a PCF rule book, okay, which AIG will be incorporating and advancing the work that we're going to be doing to complement that, to benefit the industry, providing training and education around there. So this is one area in which collaboration has been key. It's been global, and the innovative future that we see for this will be very helpful to help companies address. And you'll notice here, this last bullet point down here, several of the pieces of legislation that we've already talked about. Okay, were there any questions or comments on Catena X? Is there a baseline knowledge level of Catena X?
I think yes. If not, I could put a link to the website from Catena X for further information if anybody has interest or wants to learn more, if not known already. But I think Catena X already here, specifically in the terms of material digitalization or carbon footprint, Catena X had been in this area for quite some time at the right now. So yeah.
Yes. That's why I thought that you all might have a knowledge of it. One thing that you may not be aware of is that AIG is the North American hub for Catena X. So we're making sure that there is alignment and there's a global voice in there as to what's going into Catena X, so that we accomplish the goal and are making something that is global for the broad industry. Okay, so here is yet one more example of what is being done in the terms of collaboration on sustainability, looking at and taking an existing industry process, expanding it, improving it to benefit the sustainable requirements sustainable reporting requirements. Okay, so the next slide here, actually I've touched on it several times, so I'll just highlight a few points here to talk about global collaboration around forced labor. AIAG has worked with, and you'll see the brands in just a second, 6 OEMs to develop a training program, an overall comprehensive program to benefit the suppliers in helping them begin their journey for forced labor due diligence. As I mentioned, it's important for a supplier to understand their degree of exposure, where they're operating, and what laws pertain to that. So legislative awareness is one piece of the program that we've collaboratively developed with the OEMs. And in addition to working with those 6 OEMs, AIAG included 21 Tier 1 suppliers as part of our stakeholder review. Before we launched the program, we reviewed it with them, we laid it out for them, and got their feedback and input, which was incorporated, and we continue to do that. Not only did we conduct outreach to the suppliers, we conducted outreach to other organizations. I mentioned Drive Sustainability. There are a plethora of others that we brought to the table to say, this is what we're working on as an industry. We want you to be aware of it. We want to provide an opportunity for you to be open and comment on this. We're not trying to be very protective. This is something that only works or works to a greater benefit if we have a broader industry utilization. Equally, we are in talks with additional OEMs to bring them on board with this particular program in the hopes that by bringing more OEMs to the table, we will be able to reduce the number of survey requests that suppliers receive. If we take a common approach to this, that is our goal. So what we've included in the program, legislative awareness, training and resources, again, educating the supply chain, but also technology service providers. Okay? We've gone through and we've vetted some of those providers that we know that are being used by the US government. As I mentioned, the US government is using AI and publicly available tools to identify where they have suspicions on an importer's goods, perhaps being tainted with forced labor. So AIAG has identified a risk provider and 3 mapping providers. And to their credit, I will say that the OEMs are not requiring their suppliers to use these providers. They are not directing them to do that. They are expecting that the supplier is doing something to manage the due diligence of their supply chain. Okay. The one thing that the OEMs are requiring their suppliers to use is a form we are calling the Due Diligence Report Template, or the DDRT. That's a freely available Excel spreadsheet that the 6 OEMs have come together and agreed to accept. So a supplier can complete that or utilize a service provider to complete that on their behalf and then submit that to multiple customers. So it's one-to-many as opposed to one-to-one. Okay. Now, perhaps some of you have seen this letter that was circulated on August the 19th. These are the 6 OEMs that we have been working with on developing this forced labor due diligence program. I've added QR codes in there. Hopefully that'll help you access that easily on our website. This letter is a 2-page letter that I've just kind of truncated and put in some images here. This letter was signed by the global executive vice presidents of purchasing at these companies. In here, they talk about a shared responsibility. Because one thing I do point out to suppliers is that the US government focuses the importer of record. That importer could be a supplier, it could be an OEM. So the OEMs are subject to the same level of scrutiny as the suppliers are, because it's focused on the importer. So in here, these OEMs wanted to highlight that this is a shared responsibility. They wanted to give guidance to the supply chain, but they also wanted to communicate the expectation that the suppliers need to participate, need to take accountability in managing this issue. The OEMs began kind of a pilot program. It's going on right now for a select number of suppliers. They being the OEMs, are gathering feedback and input, which we are incorporating in advance of the mid-2026 reporting requirement that is going to be expanded to a broader cross-section of suppliers. Now, it's OEM discretion as to whether they're looking at their high-spend suppliers, their high-risk suppliers, or based on the geographic location of their supplier. That was some of the thought process that went into this soft pilot. But again, we're going to refine the project as we go. But in mid-2026, more suppliers will be asked to submit the DDRT template. I can share with this audience that in 2026, early 2026, we will be expanding the number of OEMs that are participating in this. So everything that I've shared up to this point about getting started, understanding your supply chain, identifying your risk, getting your due diligence process is all in line with this particular program and the expectation of the OEMs. I'll pause there if there are any questions that may have come in, Andre.
I've shared the link to the DDRT download on the AIAG's website. So thank you very much for letting us know what to expect.
This is a big one, and actually I was in a meeting yesterday with the executive VPs, and we continue to give them an update on where we stand with this particular project.
We have one question, Tanya, which is, even though the AIAG as an international and global acting organization, how significant do you think the current influence of current American economic policy is on AIAG?
Current economic policy in terms of, I don't know if the question can be a little more specific.
Yes, I believe economic policy is probably mostly tariffs at the moment.
Tariffs, the impact on AIAG as an organization, minimal, okay? Because we don't procure products such as that. However, what we are doing in terms of tariffs is working with industry to identify ways in which we can streamline some of the survey requests and burdens on them. AIAG, in rather short order, developed 3 tariff reporting templates. So again, going back to how we work, we brought together the subject matter experts around customs and trade, and we developed a template for aluminum. We developed one for steel, and we did one for 232 copper derivatives.
So we could say that AIAG, you as an organization, are trying to help navigate through the situation, right?
Yes, we are definitely trying to navigate. We have we just had a customs and trade town hall event, and we were scheduled to bring representatives in from the US government, but at that point in time, the government was shut down. And we were not able to bring in those subject matter experts, but we bring in customs brokers who work with a lot of companies and understand all of the nuances around managing and dealing with tariffs. We are doing trainings on understanding tariffs. Duty drawback is another training that we're going to be offering beginning in January. Customs and trade is an area in which you can't go to. I think there may be one university, and it actually may be in Europe, where you can go and get a degree in customs and trade.
Mm.
Ultimately, customs and trade professionals learn on the job.
Yeah.
And we are developing, and we've done our first what we call a master class. And it's different modules to help people understand what they need to know to navigate all of these tariff issues. And trust me, they're coming at us fast and furious, and we're constantly working to understand what the expectation is of the industry, how we can help the suppliers meet that, but also educating them on things such as duty drawback. Duty drawback is one thing that companies didn't pay a lot of attention to now. But because of the amount of funds that are being paid for tariffs, if in fact a tariff is repealed, or if the Supreme Court, votes that the tariffs were unconstitutional and they need to be paid back, of course, the US government is not going to initiate that refund. Suppliers need to go in and be able to know how to go about calculating that, understanding it, managing it, and then going back to request it. So those are the types of things that we're doing to help the supply chain as it pertains to tariffs. Now, the next thing that's going to be discussed in 2026 is the free trade agreements, the USMCA renegotiations. I was in Mexico 2 weeks ago, and I spoke with a representative of the organization in Mexico that's going to have a voice into those negotiations. So we're monitoring that closely. We have provided training on USMCA before. However, that's defunct now because everything has changed. So we're trying to be agile and trying to be responsive, but that's how AIG is focused on tariffs and the economic piece of that. Now, will that change what is needed here? Not likely, because this legislation, the UFLPA, is one piece of legislation that's not in question. Okay. It's important for me to share with you that UFLPA was passed in June of 2023 with 91% bipartisan support within the U.S. Congress. I don't know if any of you follow U.S. politics, but that was a tall order to have bipartisan support at that point in time. The architects of this legislation are still very active. One of them is our Secretary of State. Okay. The other thing to take note of with U.S. politics is earlier in the year, there was an effort taken to reduce the spend of government. Budgets were being slashed, departments were being eradicated, people were being let go. As far as I have heard, there have been 2 organizations that received funding dollars. The one is Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which reports to them. They received additional funds. So that's where I always share with people when I speak. Don't think that UFLPA is going away. Don't think that the need for industry is there for us to back off of that. I could say something similar for the omnibus in Europe and what it's doing for its various pieces of legislation. It's delaying the start dates, but it's not it's not making the legislation go away. There is some concern that there may be some softening of the legislation.
Exactly.
But I encourage companies to look at these delays as a gift. Use that time to make sure that you are prepared when and if the legislation comes. There's one thing that definitely happens in the US every 4 years. we get a new administration. And sometimes we take 2 steps back or 2 steps forward. So we, as an industry, have to make sure that we're resilient and prepared regardless of the legislators or the legal challenges that affect this legislation. So hopefully I've answered that.
Thank you very much for those insights and your perspective on that. It was very interesting.
Good, good. So I think we're coming up on time here, Andre.
Yes, exactly. We
Okay.
are, or yeah.
So
So we are
again, the other
towards the end.
information, yeah, I'm glad we were able to answer the questions throughout. The other
Exactly.
information I had in here is information that you all can read. It talks about the benefits of collaboration, and this information I derived directly from the OEMs. For those who may be inquiring or curious about other activities that I didn't mention today, here are some of the other offerings that we have, some of the other pieces of legislation that we're watching. And that concludes what I wanted to share with you all today. I do appreciate your time, your attention, your questions. If you have any other questions, Andre, you can reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer those, and please share the slides with everyone.
Tanya, thank you so much for your insight and talk on the sustainability and legislation topics. And of course, if there are any questions after, or if you go through the slides and have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to TopQM. And of course, we can then forward some points we cannot answer to Tanya for any deeper responses to that. So thank you everyone for joining the session, and Tanya, again, thank you very much. It was quite a lot to take in, but I think the topic on sustainability is very much linked to legislation, I believe, and so there's always the direct link, and we dive directly into legislation talk when we're talking about sustainability. But it was very interesting to hear, and thank you very much. And I hope, yeah, that we will see some other very helpful offerings, insights, guidelines, and perspective from AIG on the topic, and I'm sure we will. Thank you very much for your work at AIG on that topic. And yeah, I would say that would be it for the day. Thank you everyone that participated throughout the day for the different sessions. And we have our opening tomorrow at 9:30. And then we have another interesting topic at 10 about the integrated management systems. Thank you very much and have a great evening. And Tanya, have a great day.
Thank you all thank you all, and enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.